The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace as 8-year-old Tommy Wilson clutched his mother's hand tightly. His wide blue eyes darted everywhere, taking in the golden chandeliers, towering portraits of kings and queens, and the sheer magnificence of everything around him. This was supposed to be the highlight of their London vacation, a guided tour of the royal residence that his mother had saved months to afford. Tommy's mother, Sarah, was a single parent working 2 jobs back in their small town in Ohio. She had always dreamed of showing her son the world beyond their modest apartment, and this trip to London was her way of giving him memories that would last a lifetime. She watched with joy as Tommy's face lit up at every new room they entered, his innocent wonder making all her sacrifices worthwhile. The tour guide, a stern-looking woman in her 50s named Mrs. Henderson, led their group of 20 tourists through the staterooms. She spoke in a crisp British accent about the history of each room, the priceless artifacts, and the traditions that had been maintained for centuries. Tommy listened intently, occasionally, tugging on his mother's sleeve to whisper questions that she would quietly answer. As they moved through the palace, Tommy noticed something that the adults seemed to overlook. Standing at attention in various positions throughout the rooms were the Queen's guards, dressed in their iconic red tunics and tall black bearskin hats. These guards stood perfectly still like statues, their faces expressionless and their eyes fixed straight ahead. Tommy had seen pictures of them in books, but seeing them in person was different. They seemed almost magical to him, like toy soldiers that had come to life. The group entered the throne room, a magnificent space with red carpet, golden walls, and 2 ornate thrones sitting on a raised platform. Mrs. Henderson began explaining the significance of the room and the ceremonies that took place there. Tommy, however, was distracted by one particular guard standing near a tall window. This guard looked younger than the others, perhaps in his early 20s, and something about his posture seemed different. While Mrs. Henderson droned on about royal protocols, Tommy studied the guard more closely. The young man's hands were trembling slightly, almost imperceptibly. Beads of sweat had formed on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the palace. His breathing seemed shallow and rapid, though he was clearly trying to maintain his composure and the traditional stoic appearance expected of the Queen's Guard. Tommy had always been an observant child, more perceptive than most adults gave him credit for. He had a natural ability to read people's emotions and body language, a skill that often surprised his teachers and family friends. Looking at this guard, Tommy could sense that something was very wrong. The man was struggling, fighting against something that the watching tourist couldn't see. The other members of the tour group were busy taking photos and listening to Mrs. Henderson's explanations about the portraits hanging on the walls. They occasionally glanced at the guards, treating them more like part of the room's decoration than actual people. This casual dismissal of the guards as human beings bothered Tommy, though he couldn't quite put his feelings into words. His mother was engaged in conversation with another tourist, a friendly elderly man from Canada who was sharing stories about his own grandchildren. The tour guide had moved the group toward the far end of the room to show them a particularly impressive painting of Queen Victoria. Tommy found himself standing closer to the struggling guard than anyone else in the group. The 8-year-old boy continued to watch the guard with growing concern. The trembling in the young man's hands was getting worse, and now Tommy could see that his face had gone pale beneath the shadow of his bearskin hat. The guard's eyes, which were supposed to remain fixed and unfocused, occasionally darted nervously around the room before snapping back to attention. Tommy had seen this kind of distress before. His neighbor back home, Mr. Peterson, was a war veteran who sometimes had what his mother called difficult moments. Tommy had learned to recognize the signs of someone fighting an internal battle, someone who needed help but was too proud or too trapped by circumstances to ask for it. The young guard's situation was becoming more critical by the moment. His professional training and the weight of royal tradition demanded that he remain perfectly still and silent, no matter what personal struggles he might be facing. But Tommy could see that the man was losing his battle against whatever was overwhelming him. Mrs. Henderson called for the group to gather near the thrones for a group photograph. As the tourists shuffled around, Positioning themselves for the picture, Tommy remained near the window, his eyes never leaving the distressed guard. He knew that adults often missed things that seemed obvious to him. They were too busy following rules and social expectations to notice when someone desperately needed help. The guard's breathing had become even more labored, and Tommy could see that his legs were beginning to shake slightly. Whatever was happening, to this young man it was getting worse, and Tommy realized that if someone didn't do something soon, the guard might collapse right there in front of everyone. The weight of this realization settled on the 8-year-old's shoulders as he stood in that grand throne room, feeling very small but somehow understanding that he might be the only person who truly saw what was happening. Tommy's heart raced as he watched the guard's condition worsen. The young man's face had turned an alarming shade of white, and small droplets of sweat were now visible on his chin. The 8-year-old knew he had to act, but the magnitude of where he was and what he was about to do made his stomach flutter with nervous energy. The tour group was still gathering near the thrones, with Mrs. Henderson fussing over the perfect arrangement for their photograph. Camera flashes popped occasionally as tourists took their own pictures, completely unaware of the drama unfolding just a few feet away. Tommy's mother was adjusting her purse strap and checking her own camera, preparing to capture this special moment of their vacation. Tommy took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. He walked directly up to the struggling guard, his small sneakers making soft sounds on the polished marble floor. The distance between them seemed enormous to the little boy, each step requiring tremendous courage. He had been taught to be respectful of authority figures and to follow rules, but something inside him knew that sometimes helping someone was more important than following protocol. Standing directly in front of the guard, Tommy looked up at the young man's face. Up close, he could see the tension in the soldier's jaw and the way his eyes were fighting to stay focused straight ahead. The guard's military training was at war with his body's desperate need for relief from whatever was overwhelming him. "Excuse me, sir," Tommy said in his clear, innocent voice that carried further than he expected in the vast room. "Are you okay? You don't look very good." The words cut through the murmur of tourist conversations like a knife. Mrs. Henderson stopped, mid-sentence in her explanation about royal photography protocols. Camera preparations halted. Every head in the room turned toward the small boy standing fearlessly before the Queen's guard. The guard's eyes flickered down toward Tommy for just a moment before snapping back to their required position. In that brief instant of eye contact, Tommy saw something that confirmed his instincts. There was gratitude there, mixed with desperation and fear. The young man wanted to respond, wanted to accept help, but the rigid expectations of his position held him frozen in place. "Tommy!" his mother called out, her voice carrying a mixture of embarrassment and concern. "Come back here right now. Don't bother the nice guard." But Tommy didn't move. Instead, he stepped even closer to the guard and spoke again, his voice louder this time and filled with the kind of determined compassion that only a child can possess. "I think you need to sit down. My teacher says when people look like you do, they need to rest before they fall down." The silence in the room became deafening. Mrs. Henderson's mouth fell open in shock. The other tourists stood frozen, unsure whether to be amused, horrified, or impressed by the boy's boldness. Some began whispering among themselves, wondering what would happen when a child broke the unspoken rule about not interacting with the guards. Sarah Wilson felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as she hurried toward her son. "I'm so sorry," she began saying to no one in particular. "He's just a child, he doesn't understand the rules." But as she got closer to Tommy and the guard, she too began to notice what her son had seen. The young man was clearly in distress, his professional facade cracking under the weight of whatever internal struggle he was facing. Her maternal instincts, the same ones that had helped her raise Tommy on her own, suddenly kicked in. Tommy reached up and gently touched the guard's trembling hand. The contact was brief and innocent, but it was enough to break through the young soldier's rigid training. For a moment, his mask of professional indifference slipped, and everyone in the room could see the human being beneath the uniform. "Please," Tommy said softly, his 8-year-old voice carrying wisdom beyond his years. "It's okay to need help. Everyone needs help sometimes. The guard's breathing became more ragged, and now even the adults who had been focused on their photography could see that something was seriously wrong. The young man was fighting a losing battle against what appeared to be a severe anxiety attack or panic episode, brought on by the pressure of his duties and the stress of maintaining perfect composure in front of crowds day after day. Mrs. Henderson, despite her initial shock at the breach of protocol, was experienced enough to recognize a medical emergency when she saw one. She quickly moved toward the guard while pulling out her radio to contact palace security and medical staff. Tommy remained right where he was, looking up at the guard with eyes full of concern and understanding. "My name is Tommy," he said conversationally, as if they were meeting in a park rather than in one of the most formal settings in the world. "What's your name? I bet you have a really nice name." The guard's lips moved slightly, as if he wanted to respond but couldn't quite break through the wall of his training. His hands were shaking more visibly now, and it was clear to everyone in the room that he was fighting against a complete breakdown. Other tourists began to step back, giving the scene more space, but Tommy remained steadfast in his position. His mother reached him and put her hand on his shoulder, no longer trying to pull him away but instead providing silent support for his instinct to help. "It's okay," Tommy continued, his voice steady and reassuring. "You don't have to be scared. My mom says that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing even when you are scared. And right now, the right thing is to let people help you." The wisdom in those words, coming from such a young voice, seemed to resonate with everyone present. The guard's rigid posture began to slump slightly as his body finally began to acknowledge what his mind had been fighting against. Help was coming, and for the first time in what felt like hours, he didn't have to face his struggle alone. The palace medical team arrived within minutes of Mrs. Henderson's radio call, their footsteps echoing rapidly across the marble floors. Dr. Margaret Collins, the palace physician, entered the throne room with her medical bag and 2 paramedics behind her. She had dealt with various medical emergencies in the palace before, but never one involving a guard breaking down in front of tourists. As the medical team approached, Tommy still stood his ground next to the struggling guard. The young soldier's condition had worsened significantly. His breathing was now shallow and rapid. His face had turned pale with a slight grayish tint, and his legs were visibly shaking beneath his ceremonial uniform. The bearskin hat that was supposed to make him look imposing now seemed to weigh him down like a burden. Dr. Collins quickly assessed the situation with professional efficiency. "He's having a severe panic attack," she announced to Mrs. Henderson while pulling medical equipment from her bag. "We need to get him seated and calm down immediately." The guard, whose name tag read Williams, tried to maintain his position, even as his body betrayed him. Years of military training had ingrained in him the absolute necessity of staying at his post, no matter what personal challenges he faced. But his legs were beginning to buckle, and it was clear that he wouldn't be able to remain standing much longer. Tommy looked up at Dr. Collins and tugged gently on her white coat. "Dr. Lady," he said with the directness that only children possess. "He's been trying to be brave for a really long time, but I think he's too tired now. Can you help him sit down?" Dr. Collins looked down at the earnest little boy and smiled, despite the seriousness of the situation. "You're absolutely right, young man. Sometimes the bravest thing someone can do is accept help." She turned to the guard and spoke in a calm, authoritative voice. "Williams, I'm ordering you to take a seat. Medical emergency protocols override ceremonial duties." The word ordering seemed to give the guard the permission he needed to finally let go. Military personnel are trained to follow orders, and having a medical order to break from his post allowed him to surrender to his body's needs without feeling like he was failing in his duty. With help from the paramedics, Williams was gently guided to a chair that had been quickly brought from an adjacent room. As soon as he sat down, the relief was visible on his face. His breathing began to slow slightly, though he was still clearly in the grip of the panic attack. Tommy's mother, Sarah, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of pride and concern for her son. She had always known Tommy was special, but seeing him show such compassion and courage in this intimidating environment made her heart swell, At the same time, she worried about how this unusual situation might affect him. Dr. Collins began working with Williams, using breathing techniques and reassurance to help him through the worst of his panic attack. She spoke to him in low, calming tones, explaining what was happening to his body, and assuring him that he was safe and that what he was experiencing was temporary. Meanwhile, Tommy remained close by, his presence somehow comforting to the struggling guard. Without being asked, the 8-year-old began talking to Williams in his natural, conversational way. "You know," Tommy said, "I get scared sometimes too. When I started 3rd grade, I was so scared I threw up in the bushes outside school. But my mom told me that feeling scared just means you care about doing a good job." Williams, despite his distress, managed to look down at Tommy with what might have been the hint of a smile. The innocence and sincerity in the boy's voice was cutting through the fog of his panic, in a way that adult reassurances sometimes couldn't. The other tourists had been moved to a different section of the room to give the medical team space to work, but they remained quietly observant of the unfolding drama. Many of them were taking pictures, though more out of concern and fascination than mere curiosity. This was clearly not something that happened during typical palace tours. Mrs. Henderson was dealing with the logistical challenges of the situation, coordinating with palace security and trying to maintain some semblance of order with her tour group. She had been giving palace tours for over 15 years and had never encountered anything quite like this. The combination of a medical emergency and a child's unprecedented interaction with a guard was completely outside her usual experience. Tommy continued his one-sided conversation with Williams, sharing stories about his life back home, his pet goldfish named Captain Bubbles, and his favorite subjects in school. His chatter was the kind of innocent babbling that adults often tune out, but in this context it served as a lifeline for the overwhelmed guard. "My teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, says that everyone has hard days," Tommy explained to Williams. "She says that's what makes the good days so special. I bet tomorrow will be a better day for you." Dr. Collins looked up from her patient and caught Tommy's eye. "You know," she said quietly, "you might be the best medicine he's gotten all day." The comment made Tommy beam with pride, though he didn't fully understand the significance of what he had done. Williams's breathing was gradually returning to normal under Dr. Collins's care, but it was clear that he would need more than just immediate medical attention. The stress and pressure that had led to this breakdown had been building for some time, and addressing the root causes would require more comprehensive support. As the immediate crisis began to stabilize, everyone in the room started to realize that they had witnessed something truly extraordinary. A child's simple act of compassion had not only potentially saved a man from a serious medical episode, but had also revealed important truths about human connection, courage, and the power of seeing beyond uniforms and titles to the person underneath. As William's breathing gradually returned to normal, Dr. Collins encouraged him to talk about what had triggered such a severe panic attack. The throne room had grown quiet except for Tommy's occasional gentle questions and the soft murmur of concerned tourists in the background. What Williams revealed in those next few minutes would shock everyone present and change how they viewed the seemingly glamorous world of royal duties. "It's been building up for weeks," Williams admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He was a 23-year-old from a small village in Wales, and this was only his 6th month serving as one of the Queen's guards. The pressure to be perfect every single day, to never show any emotion or human reaction, it's been eating away at me. Dr. Collins nodded encouragingly while monitoring his pulse. "Tell me more about what you've been experiencing." Williams looked around the room, his eyes stopping briefly on Tommy, who was listening with the intense focus that children bring to adult conversations they find important. "I haven't been sleeping well. Every night I worry about making a mistake. The next day, what if I faint during a ceremony? What if I react to something I shouldn't? What if I bring shame to the regiment?" Tommy, who had been sitting cross-legged on the floor next to William's chair, suddenly spoke up. "But you haven't made any mistakes. You were doing a really good job standing there. I was watching you the whole time." The simple honesty in Tommy's observation seemed to surprise Williams. He had been so focused on his internal struggle that he hadn't realized he was actually performing his duty successfully, even while fighting his panic. Mrs. Henderson, who had been listening from a respectful distance, stepped forward. "Williams," she said gently, "in all my years of giving tours here, I've watched hundreds of guards. You've always been one of the most professional and dedicated I've seen." Williams looked up in surprise. He had assumed that the tour guide saw the guards as mere fixtures, part of the palace scenery rather than individuals with their own challenges and achievements. Learning that his efforts had been noticed and appreciated was both comforting and overwhelming. Dr. Collins continued her gentle questioning, uncovering more of the story. Williams explained that he had joined the military straight out of school, driven by a desire to serve his country and make his family proud. His father had been a career soldier, and Williams felt enormous pressure to live up to that legacy. The prestigious assignment to the Queen's Guard had seemed like a dream come true, but the reality had been much more challenging than he had anticipated. "I see tourists every day who look at us like we're not real people," Williams continued, his voice getting stronger as he spoke. "They take photos and sometimes make jokes, but no one ever sees us as individuals with our own struggles and feelings. Today, when that panic started building, I felt more alone than I've ever felt in my life." Tommy's mother, Sarah, who had been watching this conversation with growing emotion, found herself thinking about her own struggles as a single parent. She understood the feeling of putting on a brave face every day while fighting private battles that no one else could see. "I know about feeling alone," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "When my dad left, I felt really alone even when Mom was right there with me. But Mom taught me that feeling alone and being alone are different things. She said there are always people who care, but sometimes we have to be brave enough to let them know we need help." The wisdom in Tommy's words struck everyone in the room. Here was an 8-year-old child articulating insights about human connection and vulnerability that many adults struggle to understand. Williams looked down at Tommy with something approaching awe. "You know what the strangest part is?" Williams continued, addressing his comments to Tommy as if the boy was his primary confidant. "When you came up to me and asked if I was okay, it was the first time in months that someone had seen me as a person instead of just a uniform. That's when I realized how much I needed someone to notice." Dr. Collins made notes in her medical pad while listening to this exchange. She had been the palace physician for over a decade and had seen various types of stress-related incidents, but the psychological pressure that Williams described was more severe than she had realized. His case was highlighting systemic issues that needed to be addressed. Tommy stood up and walked closer to Williams. "Can I tell you something?" he asked with the seriousness that children sometimes display when they're about to share something they consider very important. Williams nodded, genuinely curious about what this remarkable child might say next. "My mom works really hard at 2 different jobs, and sometimes I see her cry when she thinks I'm sleeping. But she's still the best mom in the whole world because she never gives up trying to take care of me. I think you're like my mom. You work really hard at a job that's difficult, and sometimes it makes you feel bad, but you keep trying to do your best anyway. That makes you pretty special." The comparison between a struggling single mother and a Queen's Guard might have seemed odd to some, but Tommy had identified the common thread of human resilience that connected their experiences. Williams felt tears forming in his eyes, the first genuine emotional release he had allowed himself in months. Sarah wiped her own eyes, moved by her son's unexpected wisdom and his ability to see the humanity in everyone he met. She was also struck by how her own struggles had apparently taught Tommy valuable lessons about empathy and strength. Dr. Collins closed her medical bag and stood up. "Williams, you're going to be fine physically, but I'm recommending that you take a few days off and speak with our counseling services. What you've experienced today isn't a sign of weakness. It's your mind and body telling you that you need support, and there's no shame in that." Mrs. Henderson approached the group with a thoughtful expression. "I think this young man," she said, gesturing toward Tommy, "has taught all of us something important today. Maybe it's time we started seeing our guards not just as symbols, but as the dedicated individuals they are." News of the incident in the throne room spread through the palace staff with remarkable speed. By the time Williams was escorted to the palace medical facility for a thorough evaluation, word had reached the upper levels of palace administration. What had started as a single child's act of compassion was beginning to create waves throughout the entire royal household. Colonel James Mitchell, the commanding officer responsible for the Queen's Guard, arrived at Dr. Collins's office within an hour of receiving the report. He was a stern man in his 50s with over 30 years of military experience, but the story he had heard about Williams and the young American boy had given him pause. In all his years of service, he had never heard of a tourist directly intervening in a guard's medical emergency. "How is Williams?" Colonel Mitchell asked Dr. Collins as soon as he entered her office. "Physically, he'll be fine," Dr. Collins replied, setting down Williams' medical chart. "But psychologically, this incident has revealed some serious concerns about the pressure our guards are under. This wasn't just a random panic attack. This young man has been struggling with severe anxiety for months, and today was simply when his body couldn't cope anymore." Colonel Mitchell frowned, processing this information. He prided himself on knowing his men, and the thought that one of his guards had been suffering silently troubled him deeply. "Has he been receiving any support?" "That's part of the problem," Dr. Collins explained. "The culture around the Queen's Guard emphasizes stoicism and perfection to such a degree that many of these young men feel they can't ask for help without appearing weak or unfit for duty. Williams told me he's been losing sleep for weeks, but was afraid to report it because he thought it might end his career." Meanwhile, back in the throne room, Tommy's tour group had been moved to continue their visit, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The other tourists kept asking Tommy questions about how he had known the guard was in trouble, and his simple, honest answers were resonating with people in unexpected ways. "I just looked at his face," Tommy explained to a retired teacher from Canada. "My mom taught me to pay attention to people's faces because that's how you know if they need help. Adults forget to look sometimes because they're thinking about other things." Mrs. Henderson found herself modifying her usual tour script as they moved through the remaining rooms. Instead of focusing solely on the historical artifacts and royal ceremonies, she began acknowledging the human element of palace life. She talked about the dedication of the staff, the challenges of maintaining centuries-old traditions, and the real people behind the uniforms and formal roles. The elderly Canadian tourist, whose name was Robert Chen, was particularly moved by the morning's events. He had served in the Korean War as a young man and recognized the signs of someone struggling with the psychological pressures of military service. After the tour ended, he asked to speak with Tommy and his mother privately. "Young man," Robert said to Tommy, "what you did today took real courage. I've seen grown men in combat who wouldn't have had the bravery to step forward like you did." Tommy looked puzzled. "But I wasn't brave. I was scared. I thought I might get in trouble for talking to the guard." "That's exactly what made it brave," Robert explained with a gentle smile. "Courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing the right thing even when you are scared." Sarah listened to this exchange with growing pride in her son, but also with a new understanding of how their struggles back home had shaped Tommy's character. His ability to recognize someone in need and act with compassion despite the intimidating circumstances was a direct result of the empathy and resilience she had tried to instill in him. Back in the palace medical facility, Williams was meeting with Dr. Patricia Hartwell, the palace's consulting psychologist. Dr. Hartwell had been called in to help Williams process not just the panic attack, but the underlying issues that had led to it. "Tell me about today," Dr. Hartwell said, settling into her chair across from Williams. "Not just the medical episode, but what happened with the little boy." Williams' face softened as he recalled his interaction with Tommy. "It was the strangest thing. Here I was falling apart in front of a room full of people, and this child just walked up to me like it was the most natural thing in the world. He didn't see my uniform or worry about protocol. He just saw someone who needed help." "How did that make you feel?" Dr. Hartwell asked. "Human," Williams replied immediately. "For the first time in months, I felt like a real person instead of just a symbol or a tourist attraction. He reminded me that it's okay to need help, that it doesn't make me weak or unworthy of my position." Dr. Hartwell made notes while Williams continued talking. "The boy told me that his mother works 2 jobs and sometimes cries when she thinks he's not looking, but that she never gives up trying to take care of him. He said that made her special, and that my situation was similar. I had never thought about it that way. That afternoon, Colonel Mitchell made an unprecedented decision. He called a meeting with all the guards currently assigned to palace duty and addressed them directly about mental health and the importance of seeking support when needed. Today, one of our own experienced a medical emergency, he began, standing, before 24 young soldiers in the palace briefing room. What happened to Williams could happen to any of you, and I want you to understand that there is no shame in struggling with the pressures of this assignment. The guards listened in surprised silence. Mental health was not typically discussed openly in military settings, especially not by commanding officers. I'm implementing new policies effective immediately, Colonel Mitchell continued. Regular check-ins with medical staff, access to counseling services, and most importantly, an environment where asking for help is seen as responsible behavior, not weakness. One of the younger guards, a 19-year-old named Davies, raised his hand tentatively. Sir, what about maintaining our professional image? Won't tourists lose respect for the guard if they see us as vulnerable? Colonel Mitchell considered the question carefully. Davies, today an 8-year-old American boy, showed more courage and wisdom than most adults I know. He saw one of our own in crisis and acted with compassion and bravery. If that child can understand that strength comes from helping each other, I think our tourists can handle knowing that we're human beings with the same struggles and needs as everyone else. 6 months later, the changes implemented at Buckingham Palace following the incident in the throne room had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond anyone's expectations. What began with a single child's act of compassion had evolved into a comprehensive program that was being studied and replicated by military organizations around the world. Colonel Mitchell stood in his office, reviewing reports from the new mental health initiative. The statistics were remarkable. Reported anxiety levels among the guards had decreased by 40%, job satisfaction had increased significantly, and most importantly, there had been no further medical emergencies related to psychological pressure. The program had been so successful that it was being expanded to include all palace staff. Dr. Collins had been documenting the changes for a research paper she was preparing on workplace mental health in high-pressure environments. The key breakthrough, she explained to a colleague, came from a child's simple recognition that the person inside the uniform was struggling and needed help. That shift in perspective from seeing guards as symbols to seeing them as individuals changed everything. Meanwhile, in Ohio, Tommy Wilson had returned to his normal 8-year-old life, but the impact of his experience at the palace continued to influence him in subtle ways. His teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had noticed that he was even more attentive to classmates who seemed upset or left out. His natural empathy had been reinforced by his successful intervention in London, giving him confidence in his ability to help others. Sarah Wilson often reflected on their trip to London, particularly the pride she felt watching her son demonstrate such courage and compassion. The experience had also given her new perspective on her own struggles as a single parent. If an 8-year-old could find the strength to help a stranger in an intimidating situation, she could certainly find the strength to ask for help when she needed it. At the palace, Williams had not only returned to duty but had become an advocate for the new mental health programs. He volunteered to speak with new guards about his experience, helping them understand that seeking support was a sign of strength rather than weakness. His story, and particularly the role that Tommy had played in it, had become part of the orientation program for all new palace staff. The most important lesson I learned, Williams would tell new recruits, came from an 8-year-old boy who saw me as a person first and a guard second. He reminded me that everyone needs help sometimes and that accepting help doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. The story of Tommy and Williams had also caught the attention of child psychologists and researchers studying empathy development in young people. Dr. Susan Clark, a professor of child psychology at Oxford University, had interviewed Tommy and his mother as part of a study on how children develop the ability to recognize and respond to others' emotional needs. Tommy's actions represent a perfect example of emotional intelligence in action, Dr. Clark explained in her research. He was able to read nonverbal cues, assess a situation accurately, and respond with appropriate compassion, despite significant social pressure to conform to expected behavior. These are skills that many adults struggle with. The Palace Tour program had also evolved based on the incident. Mrs. Henderson had worked with Palace administration to create a new approach that acknowledged the human elements of royal service while maintaining respect for traditions and protocols. Tourists were now given brief information about the dedication and challenges faced by Palace staff, creating a more meaningful and respectful experience for everyone involved. Robert Chen, the Canadian war veteran who had been on Tommy's tour, had stayed in touch with the Wilson family through letters and emails. He had been inspired by Tommy's courage to start a program in his own community for veterans struggling with mental health issues. "If a child can have that kind of courage," he wrote to Sarah, "then surely we adults can find the strength to support each other." The most significant long-term change occurred when word of the incident reached higher levels of the royal household. The Queen herself had been briefed on the situation and had expressed interest in meeting Tommy and his mother during a future visit to the United States. The royal staff was impressed not only by Tommy's courage, but by the positive changes his actions had inspired throughout the palace organization. A year after the incident, Tommy received an unexpected package in the mail. Inside was a formal letter from Buckingham Palace, signed by Colonel Mitchell, thanking him for his exceptional courage and compassion in recognizing the humanity in others and acting with kindness when it mattered most. Along with the letter was a small commemorative medallion bearing the royal seal, engraved with the words, "For outstanding compassion in service to others." The package also contained a handwritten note from Williams himself, now promoted to corporal, expressing his continued gratitude for Tommy's intervention and updating him on the positive changes at the palace. "Dear Tommy," Williams had written in careful handwriting, "I think about that day in the throne room often, and I want you to know that your courage saved more than just me. The changes that happened because of your actions have helped dozens of other guards who were struggling in silence. You showed all of us that being strong means being willing to help others and accept help ourselves." Tommy's school principal, learning about the recognition from Buckingham Palace, invited him to speak at a school assembly about kindness and courage. Standing at the podium in the school gymnasium, 9-year-old Tommy looked out at his classmates and teachers with the same earnest expression he had worn in the palace. "I don't think I did anything special," he told the assembled students. "I just saw someone who looked scared and sad, like when any of you might look scared or sad. My mom always says we should help each other, so that's what I did." The guard was really nice, and he just needed someone to notice that he was having a hard time. The simplicity of Tommy's explanation resonated with children and adults alike. Several teachers later commented that his presentation had influenced how they approached students who were struggling, encouraging them to look beyond surface behaviors to see the underlying needs of each child. Dr. Collins published her research paper about the Palace Mental Health Initiative, which was picked up by military medical journals around the world. The Tommy Wilson effect, as some researchers began calling it, became a case study in how recognition of individual humanity could transform institutional cultures that had previously emphasized conformity over personal well-being. Williams, now serving as a mentor for new guards, kept a photo on his desk taken during the medal ceremony at the palace 6 months after the incident. The photo showed him standing next to Colonel Mitchell and Dr. Collins, all of them smiling as they displayed the new mental health resources that had been implemented. But what made the photo special to Williams was the small American flag in the corner, a gift from Tommy that represented the international friendship that had grown from their brief but meaningful encounter. The story's impact extended beyond the military world as well. Mental health organizations in several countries began using Tommy's story as an example of how anyone, regardless of age, could make a difference by simply paying attention to others and responding with compassion. The narrative became part of training programs for teachers, healthcare workers, and first responders. Sarah Wilson eventually started working as a volunteer advocate for single parents in her community, inspired by her son's example to step forward and help others facing challenges similar to her own. She often spoke about how Tommy's actions in London had taught her that courage comes in many forms. and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply see someone else's struggle and respond with kindness. Years later, when Tommy was in high school, he wrote an essay for his English class about the most important day of his life. He chose to write about that morning in Buckingham Palace, but his focus wasn't on the recognition he had received or the changes his actions had created. "The most important thing I learned that day," Tommy wrote in his essay, "was that every person you meet is fighting some kind of battle that you might not be able to see. The guard looked perfect and strong on the outside, but inside he was scared and alone. I realized that being kind to people isn't just nice to do, it's necessary. You never know when your kindness might be exactly what someone needs to get through their hardest moment." The essay earned Tommy an A+ from his teacher, but more importantly, it demonstrated that the lessons he had learned as an 8-year-old continued to shape his understanding of human connection and compassion. The boy who had once silenced an entire room with his simple act of caring had grown into a young man who understood that true strength comes from lifting others up, not from standing alone. The legacy of that day in the throne room lived on in the countless lives that had been touched by Tommy's example, proving that sometimes the most profound changes in the world begin with a child's willingness to see beyond appearances and respond to human need with pure, uncomplicated love.